Imagine a boy who became king at the age of 4. He watched his own people riot outside his bedroom window. He slept in a palace where nobles plotted his death. And yet, this frightened child would grow to become the most powerful monarch Europe had ever seen. This is Louis XIV, the Sun King, whose light still shines across the centuries. But before we drift off into the story, leave a like and comment where you are listening from, so others can find their way here too. Now let us journey back to the gilded halls of 17th century France to discover how one man made himself into a god. The story of Louis XIV begins not with triumph, but with chaos. In the year 1638, France was a kingdom torn apart by war and religious conflict. The great powers of Europe had been locked in a terrible struggle known as the 30 Years' War. French armies were fighting on battlefields across the continent. The treasury was nearly empty. The common people were crushed under the weight of heavy taxes. It was into this world of uncertainty that a baby boy was born at the royal palace of Saint-Germain-en-Laye on the 5th of September. His parents were King Louis XIII and his Queen Anne of Austria. They had been married for 23 years without producing an heir. Many had given up hope that the royal line would continue. When the healthy baby finally arrived, the people of France celebrated in the streets. They called him Louis Dieudonné, which means Louis the God-given. It was a name that would prove to be prophetic. The joy of his birth was short-lived. When little Louis was only 4 years old, his father the king died of tuberculosis. The child was now King Louis XIV of France, but a 4-year-old cannot rule a great kingdom. His mother, Anne of Austria, became the regent, meaning she would govern in her son's name until he came of age. She chose as her chief minister a man who would shape the young king's entire worldview. His name was Cardinal Jules Mazarin. He was an Italian by birth, a diplomat by training, and a master of political intrigue. Together, the Queen Mother and the Cardinal would guide France through one of the most dangerous periods in its history. They would also teach the young Louis lessons he would never forget. The relationship between the young king and Cardinal Mazarin was complex and deeply influential. Mazarin was more than just a minister. He became a father figure to the fatherless boy. He spent hours each day with Louis, teaching him about statecraft, about the balance of power in Europe, about the management of men and money. He showed him how to read a diplomatic dispatch, how to identify the hidden motives behind a nobleman's flattering words. The cardinal believed in learning through observation. He brought the young king to council meetings. He let him watch as decisions were made. He explained why certain choices were necessary, even when they were unpopular. Louis absorbed these lessons like a sponge. He learned that a king must be patient. He learned that a king must keep his own counsel. He learned that trust was a luxury that rulers could rarely afford. The first great crisis came when Louis was just 10 years old. It was called the Fronde, a name that comes from the French word for slingshot. It began as a rebellion by the judges and lawyers of Paris, who were angry about new taxes. But it quickly grew into something far more dangerous. The great nobles of France, the princes and dukes who had vast lands and private armies, saw an opportunity to seize power for themselves. They joined the revolt. For 5 long years, from 1648 to 1653, France was torn apart by civil war. The young king experienced horrors that would mark him for life. One night in January of 1649, a mob of angry Parisians stormed toward the royal palace. The Queen Mother grabbed her 2 young sons and fled into the cold winter darkness. They escaped the city with only the clothes on their backs. For weeks, the royal family lived as refugees, moving from place to place, never knowing if they were safe. On another terrible night, a crowd of citizens actually broke into the palace and demanded to see the king. They wanted to make sure he had not been spirited away. The young Louis had to pretend to be asleep while strangers filed past his bed, staring at him by candlelight. He lay perfectly still, barely breathing, while the enemies of his crown stood inches away. The humiliations continued throughout those terrible years. Louis saw his mother weep with frustration and fear. He watched as powerful nobles, who should have been his loyal subjects, openly defied the crown. He saw armies march across France, not to defend the kingdom from foreign enemies, but to fight against their own king. He learned that his royal blood meant nothing if he did not have the power to back it up. He learned that a crown was just a piece of metal if the man who wore it could be pushed around by his subjects. The boy who should have been the most powerful person in France was reduced to a pawn in the games of ambitious men. These experiences burned themselves into the young king's mind. He He learned 3 lessons that he would never forget. The first lesson was that the nobles could not be trusted. They were not loyal servants of the crown. They were ambitious rivals who would destroy the kingdom to advance their own power. The second lesson was that Paris itself was dangerous. The city that should have been the jewel of his realm was a place of mobs and riots, a place where kings could be humiliated. The third lesson was the most important of all. He learned that a king must be strong. A king must have absolute control. A king must never, ever allow anyone to challenge his authority again. The frightened boy, who had pretended to sleep while strangers watched him, was already dreaming of the day when no one would dare to question his power. The Fronde was eventually crushed. Cardinal Mazarin, who had been forced into exile twice during the conflict, returned to power and spent the next several years rebuilding the authority of the crown. He worked tirelessly to train the young king in the arts of government. He taught Louis about diplomacy, about finance, about the management of armies. He also accumulated a vast personal fortune, making himself one of the richest men in Europe. Some whispered that the cardinal was too powerful, that he was the true ruler of France while the king was merely a figurehead. Louis watched and learned. He said little. He waited. During these years of waiting, Louis developed the skills and habits that would define his reign. He learned to control his emotions, to never let his face betray his thoughts. He practiced the art of listening more than speaking. He studied the men around him, learning their strengths, their weaknesses, their hidden desires. He came to understand that information was power, and that a king who knew everything about his servants could control them completely. He also developed his famous work ethic. Even as a young man, he rose early and worked long hours. He understood that to rule personally, he would need to master every detail of government. On the 9th of March in the year 1661, Cardinal Mazarin died. He was 58 years old and had been the effective ruler of France for nearly 2 decades. On his deathbed, the cardinal gave Louis his final advice. He warned him about certain ministers who were too ambitious. He recommended others who could be trusted. He urged him to be his own master and never to rely too heavily on any single advisor. He told the young king to work hard and to master the details of government himself. The next morning, the Council of Ministers gathered, expecting to learn who would be the new chief minister. They assumed that Louis, now 22 years old, would appoint another powerful figure to run the government for him. Previous kings had always relied on such men. It was simply how France was ruled. The ministers asked the young king to whom they should now address themselves for the business of the state. Louis gave an answer that stunned them all. He said simply that from now on, they should address themselves to him. There would be no chief minister. He, Louis XIV, would rule France himself. Many at court dismissed this as youthful arrogance. They assumed the inexperienced king would soon tire of the tedious work of government and hand power to someone else. They were completely wrong. For the next 54 years until the day of his death, Louis XIV would be the master of France in fact, as well as in name. He rose every morning at 8 o'clock and worked at the business of government for hours on end. He attended council meetings, he read dispatches, he made decisions on matters large and small. He appointed every minister, every general, every bishop. Nothing of importance happened in France without his knowledge and approval. The age of absolute monarchy had truly begun. One of the first acts of the new personal rule was the arrest and trial of Nicolas Fouquet. He was the superintendent of finances, the man who controlled the royal treasury. He was also fabulously wealthy and dangerously ambitious. Fouquet had built for himself a magnificent chateau called Vaux-le-Vicomte. In August of 1661, he held a grand party there to honour the young king. It was the most lavish entertainment France had ever seen. There were fireworks designed by the finest artists in Italy. There was a new play by the great writer Molière, performed for the first time. The feast was served on solid gold plates. The gardens were lit by thousands of candles. Fountains played in elaborate patterns. Musicians performed from hidden grottos. The effect was breathtaking. It was also a terrible mistake. Louis looked around at the splendour that his own servant had created. He saw a palace more beautiful than any of his own. He saw wealth that seemed to exceed the treasury of the crown itself. He smiled and said nothing. But inside he was filled with cold fury. How dare a mere minister live in greater luxury than the king? How dare he display such power and ambition? The party continued late into the night. Louis remained pleasant and gracious throughout. No one could have guessed what he was thinking. Within 3 weeks, Nicolas Fouquet was arrested on charges of corruption. The king sent his own musketeers to seize him. Fouquet was put on trial, found guilty, and sentenced to imprisonment for life. He would spend the next 19 years in a remote fortress in the mountains, dying in captivity, a broken man. The message was clear. There was only one sun in France, and all others must dim their light or be destroyed. But Louis did not simply destroy Fouquet. He absorbed his legacy. He took the architects, the artists, the gardeners who had created Vaux-le-Vicomte and put them to work on a project of his own. This project would become the greatest symbol of his reign and the most famous palace in the world. It was Versailles. The site was an unlikely one. It was a small hunting lodge that Louis XIII had built in a swampy, wooded area about 12 miles from Paris. There was nothing special about the location. The ground was wet and unhealthy. There was no natural beauty to recommend it. But that was precisely the point. Louis XIV would create beauty from nothing. He would impose his will on nature itself and transform a desolate swamp into a paradise on earth. The construction of Versailles took decades. At its peak, over 36,000 workers laboured on the site. They moved mountains of earth to create the famous gardens. They diverted rivers to feed the hundreds of fountains. They drained the marshes that bred the mosquitoes and fevers that killed many of the workers. Thousands of labourers died during the construction, victims of disease and accidents. The costs were staggering. It is estimated that the palace and its grounds consumed somewhere between 5 and 10% of the entire royal budget for years on end. Critics whispered that the money could have been better spent on the army or on relieving the suffering of the poor. Louis did not care. Versailles was not a luxury. It was a political tool, the most powerful weapon in his arsenal. The engineering challenges were immense. The fountains alone required a water supply that did not exist naturally on the site. Engineers built an elaborate system of pumps and aqueducts to bring water from the Seine River, miles away. The Machine de Marly, as it was called, was one of the most ambitious engineering projects of the age. It used a series of giant water wheels and over 200 pumps to lift water nearly 500 feet uphill. The noise of its machinery could be heard for miles. Even so, there was never enough water to run all the fountains at once. When the king walked through the gardens, servants would run ahead to turn on the fountains just before he arrived and turn them off again after he passed. The illusion of endless abundance was maintained through careful choreography. The gardens themselves were a masterpiece of geometric perfection. The designer, André Le Nôtre, created a landscape that extended for miles in every direction. Long, straight avenues lined with carefully trimmed trees stretched toward the horizon. Elaborate patterns of flower beds, called parterres, created carpets of colour. Statues of gods and heroes from classical mythology lined every path. The famous orangery housed over 1,000 orange trees, brought inside during the winter and displayed outside in silver tubs during the summer. The entire landscape was designed to glorify the king and demonstrate his power over nature itself. The palace itself was a masterpiece of Baroque architecture. The central building stretched for nearly a quarter of a mile. Its facade was adorned with hundreds of statues and intricate carvings. The interior was even more astonishing. Every room was decorated with the finest marble, the most precious woods, the most elaborate paintings and tapestries. The ceilings were covered with vast murals showing the king in the guise of Apollo, the god of the sun, driving his chariot across the heavens. Gold leaf covered every surface. Crystal chandeliers held thousands of candles. Mirrors, an incredibly expensive luxury at the time, lined entire walls. The most famous room of all was the Hall of Mirrors, a gallery over 200 feet long, with 17 massive arched windows on one side and 17 matching mirrors on the other. When the candles were lit, the effect was like standing inside a jewel. But Versailles was more than a palace. It was a trap, a gilded cage designed to hold the most dangerous creatures in France, the nobility. Louis remembered the Fronde. He remembered the princes and dukes who had rebelled against the crown. He knew that if these powerful men were allowed to stay on their estates in the provinces, they would build up their own power bases. They would gather armies and plot against him. So he found a way to neutralise them without violence. He made them want to come to Versailles. He made it the only place in France where a noble could gain favour, win appointments, and advance their family. He made it the centre of all social life, all fashion, all culture. To be absent from Versailles was to be nobody. The system was ingenious in its cruelty. Nobles who once commanded armies and ruled over thousands of peasants now competed for the honour of handing the king his nightshirt. Men whose ancestors had been kings in all but name now spent their days gambling, gossiping, and scheming for tiny advantages in the elaborate hierarchy of the court. Their fortunes, once spent on soldiers and fortifications, now flowed into expensive clothes, jewellery, and entertainments. Many noble families bankrupted themselves trying to keep up appearances at Versailles. They became dependent on royal pensions and favours just to survive. The very people who had once threatened the crown were now its most obedient servants, bound by golden chains they had placed on themselves. Life at the court of Versailles was governed by an elaborate system of rituals and etiquette. Every moment of the king's day was a public ceremony. In the morning, the highest nobles of France would gather in the royal bedchamber to watch the king wake up and get dressed. This ceremony was called the lever, meaning the rising. There was a strict hierarchy for who could be present at each stage. First came the immediate royal family. Then came the princes of the blood, those related to the king by birth. Then came the great officers of the household. The most privileged nobles were allowed to hand the king his shirt or his shoes. These small tasks were not considered demeaning. They were immense honours that men would compete for fiercely. The same ritual was repeated in reverse each night during the coucher, the ceremony of going to bed. Everything at Versailles was designed to revolve around the king. Nobles competed for the honour of holding his candlestick at night, or of being allowed to sit on a particular type of stool in his presence. The rules of etiquette covered every possible situation. There were rules about who could knock on a door, and how, about who could sit and who must stand, about who could wear a hat and who could not. There were rules about which doors you could use, which corridors you could walk through, and how low you must bow. It all seems absurd to modern eyes, but there was a cunning logic behind it. By making the nobles obsessed with these trivial honours, Louis distracted them from real power. While they were fighting over who got to carry the royal napkin, they were not plotting rebellions or raising armies. They were spending their fortunes on expensive clothes and lavish entertainments, bankrupting themselves in the competition for the king's favour. The trap had worked perfectly. The Sun King, as Louis came to be called, did not only shine on his court, he shone on all of French culture. His reign was the golden age of French art, literature, and drama. The greatest talents of the age gathered at Versailles and in Paris to entertain the king and glorify his name. The playwright Molière wrote his immortal comedies under royal patronage. His plays mocked the pretensions of society, the hypocrisy of the pious, and the foolishness of those who tried to be what they were not. The tragedies of Jean Racine explored the depths of human passion with a psychological insight that still moves audiences today. Jean-Baptiste Lully composed operas and ballets in which the king himself sometimes danced the leading role. Louis was an excellent dancer and often performed in court ballets well into his 30s. The fables of Jean de La Fontaine became treasures of the French language. This was the era when French became the language of diplomacy and high culture across all of Europe. To be civilized was to speak French, and to speak French was to acknowledge the supremacy of the Sun King's realm. Louis understood that culture was a form of power. He spent lavishly on the arts because he knew that every masterpiece created under his patronage added to his glory. He founded the French Academy of Sciences to promote learning. He established the Academy of Painting and Sculpture to train artists in the classical style. He built the Paris Observatory and the Royal Library. He supported expeditions of exploration and scientific discovery. The great architect Jules Hardouin-Mansart designed magnificent buildings across France in the king's name. The painter Charles Lebrun created vast canvases glorifying Louis's military victories. All of this was done in his name and for his glory. The message sent to the world was clear. France was not just the most powerful nation in Europe. It was the most civilized, the most refined, the most brilliant. And all of this brilliance flowed from a single source, the Sun King himself. But there was a darker side to the reign of Louis XIV. His ambition was not limited to building palaces and patronizing artists. He wanted to make France the dominant power in Europe. He wanted to expand its borders and humble its rivals. And he was willing to go to war again and again to achieve these goals. During his long reign, France was at war for over half the time. These were not defensive wars to protect the homeland. They were wars of aggression, designed to conquer new territory and impose French dominance on the continent. The French army under Louis became the largest and most professional fighting force in Europe. The king appointed brilliant ministers like the Marquis de Louvois to modernise and expand it. Barracks were built to house the soldiers. Uniforms were standardised. Training became more rigorous. The supply systems that fed and equipped the army were improved. The great military engineer Vauban designed a ring of fortresses along the French borders that made the kingdom almost impregnable. Most importantly, the officer corps was reformed. Command positions, once sold to the highest bidder regardless of ability, were now given based on merit. Or at least that was the ideal. In practice, noble birth still mattered enormously. But the French army of Louis XIV was nevertheless the most formidable military machine Europe had seen in centuries. The first major conflict was the War of Devolution, which began in 1667. Louis claimed that parts of the Spanish Netherlands, what is now Belgium, rightfully belonged to his wife, Maria Theresa, who was a Spanish princess. The legal argument was flimsy, but the French army was strong. In a lightning campaign, French forces swept into the Spanish Netherlands and seized a string of important fortresses. The other powers of Europe were alarmed. They feared that France was becoming too powerful. England, Sweden, and the Dutch Republic formed an alliance to oppose Louis. Faced with this united front, Louis agreed to a peace treaty that gave him several important towns, but stopped short of his full ambitions. This setback only increased Louis's determination, especially his desire for revenge against the Dutch. The Dutch Republic was a small nation, but it was immensely wealthy from its global trading empire. It was also a republic, governed by merchants rather than a king. Louis despised everything it represented. He saw it as an insult to the principle of monarchy. He also saw it as a rival that needed to be crushed. In 1672, he launched a massive invasion. Over 100,000 French soldiers crossed the Rhine River and poured into Dutch territory. It seemed that nothing could stop them. The Dutch were outnumbered and outgunned. Their fortresses fell one by one. French forces advanced to within sight of Amsterdam. In their desperation, the Dutch took a drastic step. They opened the dikes that held back the sea and flooded their own land. The French army found itself stranded on shrinking islands of dry ground, unable to advance through the rising waters. The invasion had been stopped, not by an army, but by the sea itself. The war dragged on for 6 more years. Other European powers joined the Dutch, fearful of French expansion. In the end, Louis gained some territory along his eastern border, but he had failed to destroy the Dutch Republic. He had also united most of Europe against him. It was a pattern that would repeat itself throughout his reign. Each French victory only made the other powers more determined to resist. The greatest of Louis's wars came near the end of his life. It was called the War of the Spanish Succession, and it lasted from 1701 to 1714. The cause was a question of inheritance. The King of Spain, Charles II, had died without an heir. On his deathbed, he had named Louis's grandson, Philip of Anjou, as his successor. If Philip became King of Spain, the 2 most powerful kingdoms in Europe would be united under the same family. The House of Bourbon would dominate the continent. The other powers of Europe could not allow this. England, the Dutch Republic, Austria, and other states formed a grand alliance to prevent it. What followed was a world war in all but name. Battles were fought across Europe, from the plains of Germany to the mountains of Spain to the shores of the Mediterranean. French armies also clashed with their enemies in the Americas and on the oceans. The war produced some of the bloodiest battles of the era. At the Battle of Blenheim in 1704, the Allied forces under the Duke of Marlborough inflicted a crushing defeat on the French. It was the first major defeat suffered by a French army in over 50 years and more. Thousands of soldiers were killed or captured. The myth of French invincibility was shattered. More disasters followed. At Ramillies, at Oudenarde, at Malplaquet, French armies were beaten again and again. The war dragged on year after year, draining the treasury and the nation. By the end of the war, France was exhausted. The harvest had failed. A terrible winter in 1709 killed hundreds of thousands of people. The rivers froze solid. The bread froze on the tables. Wolves came down from the mountains to attack livestock and even people. The roads were filled with starving refugees. The treasury was empty. Louis, now an old man in his 70s, had seen his great army humbled and his dreams of European dominance shattered. He offered peace on humiliating terms, even agreeing to help the Allies remove his own grandson from the Spanish throne. But the Allies demanded even more. They wanted complete surrender. Pushed to the wall, Louis rallied his nation one more time. He issued a public appeal to his people, asking them to fight on for the honour of France. The French found new reserves of strength. They held on long enough for the alliance against them to fracture. England, weary of the war and its costs, made a separate peace. The English people were tired of paying for a distant conflict that seemed to have no end. Their new government wanted to focus on trade and commerce, not endless battles on the continent. Without English support and English money, the other allies could not continue. The final treaties signed at Utrecht and Rastatt ended the war. Louis's grandson was allowed to remain King of Spain, but with the condition that the crowns of France and Spain could never be united in the same person. France kept most of its territory, but was forced to give up some colonial possessions. It was a peace, born of exhaustion. No one had truly won, but for Louis, simply surviving was a kind of victory. The personal life of Louis XIV was as dramatic as his public reign. He was married twice, officially once and secretly once. His first wife was Maria Theresa of Spain. Their marriage was arranged for political reasons to seal a peace treaty between France and Spain. The young princess arrived in France barely able to speak the language, a stranger in a foreign court. Maria Theresa was a gentle and pious woman who was completely devoted to her husband. She bore him 6 children, though only one, the Grand Dauphin, survived to adulthood. Louis was fond of her, but he did not love her. He treated her with respect in public, but he betrayed her constantly in private. The Queen knew of her husband's affairs but said nothing. She suffered in silence, finding consolation in her faith and in her Spanish attendants who reminded her of home. The King of France believed that the normal rules of morality did not apply to him. He took a long series of official mistresses, women who held recognised positions at court and wielded considerable influence. The first great love of Louis's reign was Louise de la Vallière. She was a shy and gentle young woman who truly loved the king for himself, not for his power. Their affair was at first kept secret, but eventually became known to everyone. Louise bore Louis 4 children, but her position was gradually undermined by a more ambitious rival. The most famous of Louis's mistresses was Madame de Montespan, whose real name was Françoise Athénée de Rochechouart. She was witty, beautiful, and ambitious. For over a decade, she was the most powerful woman in France after the Queen. She bore Louis 7 children, several of whom he legitimised and raised to high positions. But Madame de Montespan eventually fell from favour. Rumours swirled around her, dark whispers of love potions, and even black magic. She was connected to a scandal involving poison and witchcraft that shocked the court. She was replaced in the king's affections by a woman of very different character. Her name was Françoise d'Aubigne, the Marquise de Maintenon. She had started at court as the governess of the children Louis had with Montespan. She was not beautiful in the conventional sense, but she was intelligent, virtuous, and deeply religious. Over time, Louis came to rely on her companionship more than any other. After Queen Maria Theresa died in 1683, Louis made a surprising decision. He secretly married Madame de Maintenon in a private ceremony. She was never officially declared queen. The marriage was never publicly acknowledged. But from that day forward, she was the king's true companion. Her influence over him grew and grew, especially in matters of religion. Under the influence of Madame de Maintenon and his own evolving beliefs, Louis became increasingly devout in his later years. The court that had once been famous for its pleasures became more sober and religious. But Louis also became increasingly intolerant. The great stain on his reign was his treatment of the Huguenots, the French Protestants. For nearly a century, the Huguenots had been protected by a royal edict called the Edict of Nantes. It granted them freedom of worship and certain civil rights. Louis had always disliked this situation. He believed that religious unity was essential for a strong state. He famously declared that there should be one king, one law, and one faith. In 1685, Louis revoked the Edict of Nantes. Protestantism was now illegal in France. Huguenot churches were demolished. Protestant ministers were given 2 weeks to leave the country or face death. The laity were forbidden to emigrate. Soldiers were quartered in Protestant homes to force conversions. These soldiers, known as dragoons, subjected Huguenot families to terrible abuses. They ate their food, destroyed their property, and committed acts of violence until the families agreed to convert to Catholicism. This policy was called the Dragonnades. Hundreds of thousands of Huguenots fled France, despite the ban on emigration. They escaped to the Dutch Republic, to England, to the German states, and even to distant colonies in America and South Africa. These were not ordinary refugees. Many of them were skilled craftsmen, wealthy merchants, and talented professionals. Their departure was a massive loss for France. They took their skills, their industry, and their capital with them. They strengthened the economies of France's rivals. It was a self-inflicted wound that would weaken the nation for generations. Many historians consider the revocation of the Edict of Nantes to be the greatest mistake of Louis's reign. As Louis entered his final years, he was surrounded by death. The Sun King, who had once seemed immortal, watched as his family was decimated by disease. In 1711, his son, the Grand Dauphin, and heir to the throne, died of smallpox. He was 50 years old and had spent his entire adult life waiting for a crown he would never wear. The following year, 1712, was even more terrible. His grandson, the new heir, died of measles. That grandson's wife, a beloved princess who had brought joy to the aging court, also died of the same disease within days. Their eldest son, a little boy who would have been the next king, also died. In the space of a single year, 3 generations of heirs were gone. The only surviving successor was a sickly 2-year-old child, the future Louis XV. The old king was devastated. He had outlived his children, and most of his grandchildren. He must have wondered if God was punishing him for some unknown sin. The king himself began to suffer from declining health. The illnesses of old age accumulated. He developed gangrene in his leg, a painful condition that the doctors of the time could not cure. Despite his suffering, he continued to perform his royal duties. He met with ministers, attended council meetings, and presided over court ceremonies. He maintained his dignity and composure even as his body failed him. The man who had always been in control would not give in to weakness, not even at the end. On the 1st of September in the year 1715, Louis XIV died at the age of 76. He had reigned for 72 years, the longest reign of any major European monarch in recorded history. In his final days, he summoned his young great-grandson to his bedside. He gave the child a piece of advice that seemed to acknowledge the failures of his reign. He told the boy to try to remain at peace with his neighbours. He admitted that he himself had loved war too much. He said that too great a love of war and buildings had been his downfall. He urged the child not to follow his example in those things. It was a remarkable moment of self-reflection from a man who had spent his life projecting an image of perfection. The legacy of Louis XIV is vast and complicated. He created the model of the absolute monarch that would be imitated across Europe for a century. He built Versailles, one of the most influential buildings in human history. He made France the cultural and linguistic leader of the Western world. French art, French fashion, French manners became the standard by which all others were judged. His reign saw a flowering of genius in literature, drama, music and art that rivals any period in history. The image of the Sun King, resplendent in silk and gold, still symbolises the height of royal power and magnificence. But there is a darker side to the ledger. His wars killed hundreds of thousands of people and left France exhausted and nearly bankrupt. His persecution of the Huguenots was a moral crime and an economic catastrophe. His absolute rule, while stable during his lifetime, contained the seeds of future disaster. The system he created had no room for reform, no way to adapt to changing times. The Great Palace of Versailles, which had tamed the nobility so effectively, also isolated the monarchy from the real problems of the French people. His successors, his great-grandson Louis XV and his great-great-grandson Louis XVI, would inherit a system that looked magnificent but was rotting from within. Less than 80 years after the death of Louis XIV, the French Revolution would sweep away the monarchy he had built. The Great Palace of Versailles would be stormed by angry crowds. His descendant Louis XVI would be executed by guillotine. The absolute power that Louis had worked so hard to create would be destroyed in a torrent of blood. In a sense, the revolution was a delayed reaction to the imbalances of his reign, the debts from his wars, the resentments caused by the privileges of the nobility, the hunger of a people who had been taxed to pay for palaces while they starved. And yet, even in destruction, the legacy of Louis XIV endured. Napoleon Bonaparte, the revolutionary general, who rose from the chaos to become Emperor of France, was obsessed with the Sun King. He saw himself as the true heir to Louis's glory. He imitated his style, adopted his symbols, and dreamed of the same European dominance. Even today, when we think of France, we often think of the images that Louis created. The grandeur, the elegance, the pride. The soft power of French culture, its cuisine, its fashion, its art, its language. All of this owes something to the man who made France the envy of the world. Perhaps the truest legacy of Louis XIV is Versailles itself. The palace still stands, restored and preserved as one of the most visited monuments on earth. Millions of people walk through its halls every year. They gaze at the Hall of Mirrors, where the Treaty of Versailles was signed after the First World War, an echo of history in a place built to glorify a single man. They wander through the gardens with their fountains and geometric perfection. They visit the Grand Trianon and the Petit Trianon, the smaller palaces built for royal escapes from the formality of court life. They try to imagine what it must have been like to live in such a place, to see the king pass by in all his glory, to play the endless games of courtly intrigue. The palace is a frozen moment in time, a window into a world that is both alien and strangely familiar. The story of Louis XIV is the story of a man who believed he was chosen by God to rule. He was given a kingdom in chaos and transformed it into the greatest power in Europe. In nightshirt, he survived rebellions, wars, plagues, and personal tragedies. He built monuments that still inspire awe. He patronised artists whose works still move us. He also caused immense suffering, destroyed lives, and planted the seeds of future revolutions. He was a man of contradictions, brilliant and blind, magnificent and cruel, glorious and ultimately tragic. He remains one of the most fascinating figures in all of European history, a king whose shadow still falls across the centuries. The death of Louis was followed by a period of reaction against everything he had stood for. The people of Paris, who had suffered under the weight of his taxes and his endless wars, did not mourn him as a hero. When his funeral procession passed through the streets on its way to the royal burial place at Saint-Denis, some accounts say that the crowds actually jeered and mocked the passing cortege. They threw insults at the coffin of the man who had once commanded their absolute obedience. The king who had once been feared and admired was now resented by many of his own subjects. The debts he had accumulated would burden France for generations. The structures of absolute power he had built would prove incapable of adapting to the new ideas that were beginning to spread across Europe. Yet time has a way of softening judgments. As the decades passed, the memory of Louis XIV transformed. He became less a figure of controversy and more a symbol of a lost golden age. The writers and philosophers of the Enlightenment looked back at his reign with a mixture of criticism and admiration. They condemned his wars and his intolerance, but they acknowledged his patronage of the arts and his creation of a stable, ordered state. Later generations, living through the chaos of revolution and empire, sometimes yearned for the stability and grandeur that Louis had represented. The physical traces of his reign remain scattered across France and beyond. The paintings and sculptures commissioned in his name fill museums around the world. The furniture and decorative arts created for Versailles set standards of craftsmanship that artisans still study today. The music composed for his entertainments is still performed in concert halls. The plays written for his amusement are still staged in theatres. The gardens designed to glorify him still inspire landscape architects. In this sense, the Sun King achieved a kind of immortality that goes beyond mere memory. His taste, his vision, his ambition continue to shape the world centuries after his death. In the end, the Sun King was mortal after all. The sun that had blazed so brightly for so many decades finally set on that September day in 1715. But the light it casts still illuminates our world. Every time we visit a grand palace, every time we admire a formal garden, every time we see a head of state surrounded by pomp and ceremony, we are seeing echoes of Louis XIV. He wanted to be remembered forever. In that at least he succeeded. The boy who was born in a kingdom of chaos, who hid from mobs and watched strangers file past his bed, rose to become the most powerful king in the world. His story is a testament to human ambition, for better and for worse. And so the Sun King sleeps at last, but his legend lives on.